Well, we haven't had very many brand new Greek grammars released this year, but we have had one released just a couple of weeks ago and I wanted to review it. So let's talk about the latest Greek grammar that's available for you to buy on the market today. Let's get into it. Hey there, I'm Darryl Burling from Master New Testament Greek, here to help you with the tools, habits and systems to master the Greek of the New Testament. If you're interested in learning to read biblical Greek and getting your head around what the text really says underneath the English, then I'd encourage you to sign up and get my free roadmap to mastery at masterntgreek.com/roadmap. And that'll sort of give you an overview of what's involved in the process and help you think about how to get started. Right. Today, what we're doing is we're going to look at this brand new Greek grammar by Rodney Whitacre. This is a grammar that I saw that was coming up on Preamble, and I've been looking forward to for some time. It's a brand new grammar. Now, Rodney Whitacre, for what it's worth, has been around in the Greek grammar circles for a little while. He's written a Patristic reader, a reader for reading through some of the Apostolic Fathers in Greek. It's got some words that occur less frequently at the bottom of the page, and it's got some really helpful notes. It's a great resource. And he also wrote another grammar, really rephrase it, it's more like a book designed for people wanting to refresh their Greek, which I reviewed really one of the first videos I did on this channel actually. So if you go back through, you'll find Rodney Whitacre's book for doing that as well. This though is an actual grammar, but it's not your average grammar. It's a little different to most other grammars. And you know that I review a variety of different grammars here on this channel, and primarily I've been focusing on beginning Greek grammars, but I'm going to be moving more into those intermediate and advanced grammars as time goes on. As far as grammars go, this one is really interesting. So when you look at most Greek grammars that are on the market today, or that have come out over most Greek grammars that come out, right, beginning Greek grammars particularly, the way they organize themselves is largely the number of chapters is based on how you would structure the material over 1 or 2 semesters. So you're talking normally about 30 odd chapters of actual material, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more. But around about that, and it's easy to structure it then over 1 or perhaps 2 semesters depending on what you're trying to do. And of course for each chapter it's going to be focused on a particular concept, vocabulary and some exercises. Sometimes the exercises are separate and so on. This is nothing like that. In fact, the closest thing to this grammar is Heinrich von Siebenthal's Ancient Greek Grammar, which I reviewed this a little while ago, and I'll leave a link to that just up the top here, so if you want to go check that out. This is the closest thing that I know of on the market to Rodney Whitacre's new grammar. Now, Siebenthal's is, as you can see, it's a bit of a tome, whereas this one by Rodney Whitacre, this is actually quite short, 370 pages, and I tell you what, does it pack in the information? I mean, you've got to hand it to Rodney Whitacre. There is so much information in here that for an all-in-one grammar, if you wanted an all-in-one grammar that included beginning Greek material and intermediate Greek material, like as in, Actian Sart, like what you get in Wallace, that kind of thing, it's all here. You don't need to go anywhere else, and that really does set this apart. Now, you do have a lot of that in Siebenthal as well, but of course, you've got a lot more heft that comes with it, and Siebenthal's grammar is just not available on Logos, which means that you've got to get it physically, right? You can't get the electronic copy at all. So that makes this a really interesting grammar in its own right, but it just sets it apart in a lot of ways as well. So like I mentioned, this doesn't have a lot of the resources in it that you'd normally find in a beginning Greek grammar. It's not really designed to be a self-study grammar or anything like that. It's not even really designed for you as a professor to take and then just, it's not a shrink-wrapped course outline, if you like, which what most grammars tend to be. This really is a good grammar if you are either wanting it as a reference or if you are building your own Greek grammar or Greek course, in which case this would be kind of handy. And we'll come back to that toward the end here. So while you don't get things like vocabulary and you don't get exercises in this, you do get what he calls his 12 core paradigms, and he'll walk you through those as you go through the morphological sections of this grammar. But that's really all the pedagogical help you get when you're getting this grammar, which may mean, well, why do I get this grammar? We'll come back to that at the end. Let me just tell you how this is laid out, right? First of all, this has only got 5 chapters. 5 chapters, and that's again why it's kind of similar to Siebenthal in that sense. The 5 chapters really are, you've got an introductory chapter essentially, then chapter 2 focuses on grammar generally, English and Greek, and explaining the connection between English and Greek grammar. Again, very helpful, particularly if you've got a grammar that doesn't do a good job of doing that, and some don't, right? So this is really helpful. Chapter 3 is focused on nouns and how nouns are formed, and it spends more time, I think, on the third declension variations than I've seen in any grammar. So if you want a good grammar that's going to give you a thorough overview of third declension nouns, this is well worth looking at. And then chapter 4 focuses on verbs, and again, you've got a lot of, this is morphology of verbs, so you've got a lot of detail on how the different verbs are formed, different, and it's not just, here's the middle or passive or whatever it is of the, say, the future or whatever. It's going to go into variations of those and explain those as well. So it's really quite detailed. In fact, it's probably in some ways, in terms of morphology, this has got more detail in it than Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek or Schwant's grammar, both of which are very strong morphologically. This is stronger, but then this is not set up in the same way as a pedagogical grammar, the same way that they are. Not to say this isn't, but they are, it's just different. Chapter 5 then focuses on syntax, and this is really where you've got something like a Wallace, reduced from 700 and something pages all the way down to maybe 120 to 140 pages, maybe a little bit more than that, of actual syntax, and you've got very much the same kind of number of syntactical categories as what you'll find in Wallace as well, but again, it's just shrunk right down and just simply explained very clearly, but very simply. So it's not going into, you haven't got 40 different, examples of some of these different things, and you don't have the detail that you've got in Wallace, but it's certainly enough if you're going through a beginning Greek grammar to sort of use this as a lookup. It's also got some appendices. In fact, it's got about 8 appendices. 2 that stand out to me. It's got an appendice there on accents, so you can get a really solid understanding of accents. And secondly, there's a really handy appendix that has a whole pile of information around suffixes, so noun suffixes. So if you have a noun suffix, some of those will be diminutive, some of them will be comparative, and so on. And he explains all of those in the suffixes. It's a really helpful appendices. Now, there's a bunch of others as well. Those are 2 that just stood out to me. So, let me talk then a little bit about some of the things that I think are worth knowing before you get into this grammar. But before I do that, let me just ask you, if you're finding this helpful, hit the like button, and if you haven't already done so, hit the subscribe button and the notify bell as well. Hitting the like button, it really helps me know what you like. And even if you don't like this video, hit the like button because you like a new grammar coming out anyway. So let's talk a little bit about some of the issues around scholarship in this. The scholarship in this grammar is generally very good. Whitacre tends toward, I think, a more conservative scholarship, grammatically speaking. So he's got a very good and up-to-date understanding of the middle voice, but he also seems to think, or argue at least, that there is still time in the semantics of the verb form itself. And I would argue that time is perhaps part of either the context or at best, baked into some of the lexeme, which again is pragmatics rather than semantics. So I think that's something that I found a little difficult to sort of pin down where he fell on those a little bit, but it seemed to me that he did still hold to time in the indicative as a semantic category rather than as a pragmatic value, generally speaking. But certainly it's very much aspect primary, which is, everybody should be happy with that at least. He also talks about, in chapter 5, he talks a lot about Actiensart. Now with Actiensart, there are 2 schools of thought on this. There are those like David Mathewson and Elodie Emig in this grammar here, which I'll do a review of at some point in the future, which is much more of a minimalist grammar, which you have far fewer Actiensart categories. In fact, sometimes they argue against having even thinking in that sort of way. But with this grammar, you do tend to find that they have more Actiensart categories than even something like going deeper with New Testament Greek. So it's more like Wallace, which is perhaps a little more exegetically conservative, so you're holding on to those exegetical categories, I think, and that's okay, right? There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but I think for students it's often very easy to get lost in those categories rather than actually understanding how the language is working. So I don't think this is necessarily a pro or a con unless you've got a strong preference on this, but it is something to be worth, just to be aware of as you come to this grammar and you're thinking about, well, where's the value of this? If you're focused on exegesis, this grammar will be really helpful to help you sort of understand some of the categories that are there. And this flows too into things like participles, which participles are again, one of those areas where there's lots of categories in some of the more conservative or exegetically oriented grammars, which again is okay, but again, most students just struggle with the categories of the participle. And again, I really appreciate what Mathewson and Emig have done with that by just simply eliminating categories around verbal participles, adverbial participles, and just sort of talking about, if it's prior to the main verb versus after the main verb. And I feel that's a better way of doing it. But this grammar, again, Whitacre has, attendant circumstance and all the subcategories of that and so on, which is fine. In terms of actual weakness, there's really not a lot other than what I've already talked about in terms of just FYI sort of thing. There's not a lot of weakness in this. I think one thing I think is probably a slight hindrance is in some of when he talks about principal parts, he just numbers them. And if you're familiar with principal parts, you got present and you got aorist and so on and so forth as you go across. And he numbers these, right? And that's okay, it's fine to do that. But then when you get to your charts, rather than giving you the name of the principal part or even an example of the principal part, he actually just gives you a number. And I think for students who are struggling with the different principal parts already, a number actually abstracts away the principal parts and just makes it harder to remember, and I think less, more difficult to learn as a result. So I think that's my only real critique of this, and it's not a strong critique, this is just a little thing. I just think by disintermediating some of those terms and names and replacing them with numbers, it just does make things a little more difficult for the student, because now they have to remember numbers and what those numbers represent rather than the names, which give you some clue as to what they represent. So that's a very minor thing. So then let's ask then, who would I recommend this grammar for? Well, first of all, this is not a grammar, if you're going to be learning Greek on your own, this is not a grammar you want to buy to lead you through that process. That doesn't mean to say you don't want to, buy this, but it's not laid out for that purpose. It's not going to lead you through piece by piece and give you exercises and vocabulary. It's just not going to do that, right? And you're going to need those things if you're going to be working through the material on your own. However, this is going to be very good if you are somebody who is learning Greek and you want a grammar as a reference to your primary grammar. Now, typically, when somebody's going through, say, beginning with New Testament Greek or Mounts or something like that, and they say to me, hey, what do you think of this grammar? Do you think I should use this? What do I think? Should I add something else to it? Should I use another one? Typically with, say, Mounts, I'm going to suggest beginning with New Testament Greek. With beginning with New Testament Greek, I'm going to suggest perhaps Deca. But if I'm going forward with this grammar would actually be a worthwhile supplement to go with that. So if you're going to be going through, say, beginning with New Testament Greek, and you want something you can refer to, not just through beginning Greek, but also beyond that into intermediate Greek, this grammar is really going to be helpful for you because it's got a little bit of everything. It talks through the morphology of verbs and nouns and all those details so that when you get stuck on stuff, you've got somewhere to go and look these things up. It's laid out differently. It's laid out essentially with grammar, nouns, verbs, and syntax, which is pretty easy and pretty straightforward to follow, which means that if you're looking up something around verbs, you know it's going to be in chapter 4. If you're looking up something with nouns, it's probably going to be in chapter 3. If you're struggling with something to do with grammar, then it could be in chapter 2, talking about grammar generally, depending on how basic it is, or if it's more complex, maybe it's clauses, well, that's going to be in chapter 5. So it just depends, but I think this is going to be a helpful grammar for somebody who's looking for something to augment a beginning Greek grammar. The other person I think this will be really helpful to is if you're beginning to teach Greek for the first time. This grammar is ideal for you because you're going to have your primary grammar that you're going to have students go through, and this would be helpful to sort of give you an overview of how this particular piece fits from a more holistic point of view before you go into the classroom and talk about whatever category or whatever chapter it is you're working through this particular week. This will give you a bigger view of how to plug that into the larger framework of the language. The other person I think this is ideal for is if you're looking to build your own course and you're wanting to structure it however you want to do that. This grammar could be a helpful resource to use for that. The only problem with that is A, you're going to have to create your own exercises, B, you've got to create your own vocab for it that's going to go with your exercises, and that may be actually a really good thing to do. But then thirdly, when you reference the students back to this, you're going to have to point them to probably several sections. So for instance, if you wanted to teach people about the nominative and the accusative, and maybe you're going to do this with the first declension nouns perhaps, then you're going to be referring them to part of chapter 2 and part of chapter 3, and you might even refer to some of chapter 5 as well, depending on how you're laying out your course structure. And that may be a downer for the student because now they're referring to multiple parts of the book rather than just saying read chapter 4 or whatever it happens to be. But if you're wanting to roll your own and change the order of things as you want to as you go through this, then this still may be a really good grammar to help you do that. And so I would recommend it if you are looking for a secondary grammar, or if you are teaching Greek. This is certainly the kind of grammar you definitely want to have on your shelf. And certainly if you're going through advanced Greek, doing a doctoral program where you're working with Greek, or if you're doing an MDiv perhaps and you're interested in something that's going to give you a bit of depth in Greek, then this is certainly the kind of grammar you ought to consider putting on your shelves or into your Logos library, because it's going to give you huge benefits in terms of just a basic understanding of the language from a holistic kind of top-down perspective, rather than as a chapter by chapter kind of point of view. Overall, this is a great grammar as a general overview of grammar. He packs so much into this grammar, which makes it an ideal grammar for like a beginning Greek and a sort of early intermediate Greek grammar as well. It's not overly advanced, but it does give you everything you need from a beginning and intermediate point of view. This is a good book in that sense. So I would say it's not designed for your primary Greek grammar, but it is helpful as a reference, and it is going to be helpful as something to have on your shelf to refer to regularly as you want to sort of look things up and even reference a grammar that's going to have all this material available to it. But I would love to know from you, if you've seen this grammar or have looked at this grammar, or if you've looked at Siebenthal's grammar as well. I'd love to hear from you what you think of this style of grammar. I actually think what we're seeing here is we're seeing a third category of grammar come out. We have beginning Greek grammars, we have advanced grammars, and I think Siebenthal and this grammar with Whitacre represent something that sort of tries to bridge the gap between those two. And I think it does a pretty good job, and I think that's an important spot for grammars to try and fill, because when you finish beginning Greek, you don't want something that's going to be so advanced that you get lost in it. You want something that's going to bridge that gap, and I think Siebenthal and also Whitacre, this grammar, are very helpful for doing that. But I'm interested in your thoughts. What do you think of this type of grammar? Leave a comment in the comment section below, and if you haven't already done so, hit that like button to make sure you let me know and others know that this is a helpful video. Thanks so much for watching. If you're interested in learning Greek, like I mentioned, I have a roadmap to mastery at masterntgreek.com/roadmaps, totally free. It'll give you an overview of the process, how I teach you to go from nothing to being able to read Greek in about 6 months' time. So go download that at masterntgreek.com/roadmap, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Until then, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery. I'll see you then.